So today I'm going to start off with a very serious trigger warning. I don't normally do trigger warnings because my channel is true crime and I feel like it's, something you expect. But this one's a little bit different. This is about a serial killer who did some very gruesome things. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's pretty grotesque. There will be some uncomfortable subjects we're going to talk about, including sexual assault and torture. If any of these subjects make you uncomfortable, I would really suggest skipping this video for your mental health.
Just a bunch of earth is all that's left of 4315 Charlotte. But some people will never forget the house nor the man who lived here. Bob Berdella, Kansas City's most infamous serial killer, is dead. He died in prison after his victims were killed in his home. Berdella confessed to sexually and physically torturing 6 men here. But some believe there were more victims and hope digging up the house might unearth some secrets. That's why millionaire Dell Dunmeyer, who owns the property, had workers carefully tear it down. Private Detective Ashley Hearn was here in 1988 when the truth came out, and he's been here for the past 5 weeks, making sure no other bodies turned up.
Today we're going to talk about the Kansas City Butcher, or Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. He was also called the Collector in the media, but for this video I'm going to refer to him as Bob. Bob was a serial killer that killed and tortured 6 men in Kansas City, Missouri in the 80s. I wanted to discuss the victims too and get to know them, but honestly there wasn't much information about them at all. So I just didn't want you guys to think that I'm just stuck on the serial killer, because their lives matter. And what he did to them was not okay. Bob was born January 31st, 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, and I'm sure I butchered that town name. His father, Robert Berdella Sr., worked at the Ford Motor Company, and his mother, Mary Berdella, was a stay-at-home mom. He had a brother, Daniel, who was 7 years younger than him, and he was the favorite of the family. They were Italian Catholics, and they were very religious, and he grew up in a very strict home. Bob was a very intelligent child and a very intelligent man, but he didn't have many friends growing up. He was bullied because he had a speech impediment, he had really thick glasses, and he had a heart issue pretty much his whole life. He had to take blood pressure medication. As you can imagine, Bob wasn't a very athletic child, considering he had health problems. He stuck to reading and collecting things, so he was constantly compared to his brother Daniel, who was very good, or who was very athletic. It was as a young teen that Bob realized he was gay, but in such a strict religious household, he couldn't come out to his parents. He had to keep the thoughts to himself and pretend that he was straight. He even had a girlfriend for a short time. In 1965, when Bob was 16, his father passed away at the early age of 39. He passed away from a heart attack. Because of this, Bob started to stray from religion and started to criticize it. And not long after his father passed away, his mother remarried, which really ticked Bob off. He felt like it was a betrayal to his father, so he became even more of a recluse. He threw himself into painting, coin collecting, and stamp collecting. He even had several pen pals throughout the world. Around this time, Bob was sexually assaulted by a male coworker that he worked with at a restaurant, but he never reported it or told anybody until much later. Also in 1965, Bob went to see the movie The Collector. The Collector is about a man who decides to kidnap a woman to become his sex slave. Bob said that this movie left a lasting impression on him, hence the nickname The Collector in the media. Bob graduated high school in 1967. This is when he moved to Kansas City, Missouri to go to the Kansas City Art Institute. He wanted to become a college professor. It was around this time in college that he came out as gay. And his first year of college went really well. He got good grades, he excelled. But by the second year, things started to go downhill. He started to hang out with the more rebellious crowd, and he started doing drugs and selling drugs. At 19, he was arrested for trying to sell meth to an undercover cop. And then a couple months later, he was arrested with a friend for possession of marijuana and LSD. There are at least 3 incidents that we know of that he tortured and killed animals. One of these incidents had to do with an art project. One source said that he killed a duck and cooked it for the art project, but more sources said that he killed a dog, so I'm not sure. I'm going to lean towards the dog. Another time, his friends said that he tortured a dog. He kept giving the dog sedatives to see what would happen. Because of his brutal art project, he was criticized by a professor, and Bob didn't like this at all, so he ended up quitting college. This was in 1969. To pay the bills, Bob became a short order cook. On the side, he also sold eccentric and occultish art and antiques. A lot of it was what he accumulated from his pen pals when he was younger. Interestingly enough, he joined the South Hyde Park Crime Prevention Group, and eventually he even became the chairman, but he did step down. He moved up from a short order cook to a senior cook, and he even helped create a program in a community college that helped kids go to school to become chefs. Because at the time he was making good money off his antiques, he decided to quit being a chef. When Bob wasn't working, he was paying prostitutes for their time and sex. He had several lodgers. Not all of them were prostitutes, but he would be in control of them. He would do things like loan them money so that way they owed him. A lot of his lodgers were addicts and criminals. Bob claims that he brought them in to try to help clean them up and get back on their feet. But there's not really any proof that that was his intentions. In 1982, right after he quit his job as a chef, Bob started renting a booth at a flea market where he sold his occult art and antiques. He called it Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. On July 5th, 1984, Bob abducted his first victim, 19-year-old Jerry Howell. He had known him for a few years. He had met him through Paul Howell, Jerry's father, because Paul also rented a booth at the flea market. Originally, Jerry and his friends would make fun of Bob for being gay, but one day Jerry confided in Bob and told him that he worked as a male prostitute, and they quickly became friends. Now, I'm not sure why he chose Jerry, because there didn't seem to be a reason. It didn't seem like they were fighting, anything like that, but he chose Jerry as his first victim. Bob had agreed to give Jerry a ride to a dance contest that was out of town, but on the drive, Bob kept giving Jerry alcohol and more alcohol, and once he was good and drunk, Bob took him home instead of taking him to this dance contest. Once he had Jerry at his home, he drugged him with Valium and acepromazine. Once Jerry passed out, Bob shot him up with heavy tranquilizers. Then he repeatedly sexually abused and physically abused him. 28 hours after being abducted, Jerry passed away. He asphyxiated on his own vomit from wearing a gag. It's also believed he had a hard time breathing because of all the medication that Bob had given him. Bob claims that he tried to do CPR on Jerry, but he eventually took his body to the basement and dismembered him and put him in trash bags to put him in his trash can. Now, at this time, Bob started a log or a journal of sorts. He recorded everything that he did to Jerry, every drug, how much, how Jerry was acting. and he would proceed to do this with every victim. The things that Bob did to Jerry were horrifying, and it only gets worse. This is why I don't talk in detail about the torture. With each victim, it just keeps getting more horrifying. On April 10th, 1985, Robert Sheldon came to Bob's door to ask him for a place to stay. He had stayed with him before and he had always paid rent, so Bob agreed to it. Originally, Bob claims he had no intentions whatsoever of hurting Robert, but Bob started to get annoyed with having a house guest, and when he came home from work on April 12th, Robert was super drunk and Bob was not happy about this. So Bob drugged Robert and took him to a second floor bedroom to torture him for 3 days. He claims that he only physically tortured him because he wasn't attracted to Robert, so he didn't sexually abuse him as well. On April 15th, a contractor that Bob had hired to work on his roof showed up. So, to be safe, Bob decided to kill Robert, and he put a bag over his head and used a rope to suffocate him. He took Robert to the third floor bathroom, and that's where he dissected and dismembered his body. On June 22nd of 1985, there was a super heavy rainstorm, and Bob found a teenager by the name of Mark Wallace hiding in his shed to get away from the storm. Bob knew Mark a little bit because he had hired him to do some yard work for him at one point. So to seem nice, Robert invited Mark into his home to dry off. Mark acted really depressed and stressed, so Bob offered to shoot him up with chlorpromazine. He told him it would relax him and make him feel better. It only took about a half an hour for the drug to kick in and knock Mark out, and once he was out, Bob took him up to his bedroom. He tortured him for 24 hours. Mark ended up passing away from lack of oxygen. On September 26, 1985, an old lodger by the name of James Ferris called Bob up asking if he could stay with him for a while. He was struggling. So Bob decided to meet him at a bar where they drank, and he brought James back to his home where he drugged him. He crushed up tranquilizers and put it in James's food. For 27 straight hours, Bob tortured James Ferris. When he could no longer sit up for more than 15 seconds at a time, Bob just let him die. By chance, Robert ran into an old lodger of his, Todd Stoops. This was June 17th, 1986. Todd and his wife had lived with him a couple of years back. Now, Todd was a prostitute, and he also had a bad drug addiction, but Bob didn't mind that because he had always been very sexually attracted to him. When Todd asked Bob for money for drugs, Bob invited him over for lunch and mentioned that if he slept with him, that he would give him the drug money, and since Todd's a prostitute, he agreed to these terms. So, of course, as usual, Bob drugged Todd and took him to his bedroom. Now, he was a favorite of Bob's, so Bob didn't want to kill him. He wanted to create a submissive sex slave. Now, to forewarn you, this is really disturbing, but Bob ruptured Todd's anal wall with his fist. Forensic scientists later believe this caused septic shock, and Bob said that he became weak and couldn't breathe and couldn't sit up for very long, and on July 1st he died. It's believed he died from the septic shock. In the spring of 1987, Bob met a man named Larry Wayne Pearson. They became really good friends, and eventually Larry moved in with him, and Bob said that he again had no intentions of hurting Larry. But things changed on June 23rd. Bob had to bail Larry out of jail. Larry had been robbing several gay been, and he joked about it, and I believe he made a derogatory term, but whatever he said really upset Bob, so that's when he decided that Larry would be his next victim. When Bob got Larry home, he got him drunk, and once he was drunk, he drugged him. And then he took him to his basement where he tied his hands above his head and tied the rope to a column. And I guess Larry was one of his most cooperative victims. Since Larry was so cooperative, Bob moved him to his bedroom. They agreed that he could do anything sexually he wanted to Larry, but he would lessen up a little bit on the physical torture. Larry eventually taught himself not to move while he slept so he wouldn't upset Bob or wake him up in the middle of the night. But after 6 weeks, Larry had had enough, and he bit Bob's penis. Now, of course, Bob was ticked off, so he bludgeoned Larry with a tree limb, and then he went and got a bag and ligature and suffocated him. Once Larry was gone, Bob rushed to the hospital for his wounds. This is going to come up later in this case. In the early hours of March 29th, 1988, Bob hired a prostitute, and that was 22-year-old Christopher Bryson. Once he got Christopher in his home, he knocked him out with an iron bar and then tied him up. Somehow Christopher gained Bob's trust pretty quickly. He got Bob to tie his hands in front of him instead of behind. He said it was bothering his circulation, but escape was always on Christopher's mind. One day, Bob left a book of matches in his bedroom. And once he was at work, Christopher used that opportunity to burn through the ropes on his wrists. Then he jumped from the second floor window. Of course, when he landed, he broke a bone in his foot. And at this time, Christopher was absolutely naked except for a dog collar. He saw a meter reader crossing the street, so he ran after this person to ask for help, and they went to the closest home where, of course, they called the police. 4 police officers showed up almost immediately. During questioning, they fully believed Christopher, because not only was he naked, but his eyes were red and swollen. He had scratches, scars, welts all over his body. After interviewing him, 1 police officer took Christopher to the hospital. 2 police officers stayed behind to do discreet surveillance of Bob's home, and a 4th police officer went to work trying to get a search warrant and an arrest warrant. Now, originally, Bob denied the police entry into his home, but once he was arrested for sexual assault, they were able to get a search warrant, and that's when they found all kinds of things. The police were shocked at everything they found. There was so much. I didn't include everything, but even what I included is pretty extensive. On the second floor of the home, they found the burnt ropes that Christopher had referred to tied to the foot of the bed. On the posts on the head of the bed, there seemed to have been restraints at one point, and it was so worn down it looked as if someone had struggled immensely. There was a transformer plugged into the wall with the wires and clamps leading to the bed. There was a metal tray of syringes and a lot of prescription medication. There was also an iron bar, lots of rope, and leather belts. In the closet, there was a human skull, and in the hallway, there was several human vertebrae. They had indentations on them, like they had been cut with a hacksaw and bone knives. They found the photos that Christopher had been talking about. There was 334 Polaroids and 34 snapshot prints They all depicted men either being tortured or men that were dead. There were human teeth in an envelope, and there was a chainsaw that was covered in blood and pubic hair and skin. They did a luminol test in the basement, and the basement floor was covered in blood, and so were 2 of the trash cans. In the backyard, they found a human skull that wasn't fully decomposed, and of course they found Bob's murder and torture log. When the police tried to interrogate Bob, he always invoked his right to silence. At one point, they had to ask him for a handwriting sample to compare to the log, and he denied it, so he was charged with contempt of court and received 6 months. Since this was such a big, intense case, they created a special task force of 11 detectives and 1 sergeant, and what they found in their investigation was as telling as the evidence they found. First, they spoke to a bunch of male prostitutes, and most of them said the same thing. They didn't like Bob as a client. They tried to avoid him because he would torture them and drug them, and even they had assumed that he was the reason behind Jerry Howell's disappearance. This special task force even found old police reports. He had been a top suspect in Jerry Howell's disappearance as well as James Ferris, so they did a surveillance on him, but they didn't get any evidence. Bob agreed to talk to them once, but after that he always said he was going to call his lawyer. When he found out that they were surveilling him, he used a lawyer to threaten to sue for harassment. And like I said, that hospital visit would come back into play. There was a file of Bob's visit and of his wounds in which he blamed a man named Larry. They connected Larry with Bob, and so they traced back Larry's whereabouts, and the last time he was seen by anyone was when he was bonded out, which was when he was picked up by Bob. They were slowly putting the puzzle pieces together. Next, they had to identify the bones as well as the men in the photos. The task force had Bob pose nude. They took pictures of him naked from every angle. This was to compare to the photos because some of those Polaroids didn't have the faces in them, and they wanted to rule out any of them that were of Bob. James Ferris was identified pretty quickly through photos by his wife. The same with Jerry Howell. He was identified by his father, Paul. I just can't imagine having to go through photos to identify your loved one, especially these kinds of photos. To help identify the bones and the men in the pictures, they went through every name in his torture log. Now, there weren't just the victims that he killed in this log. There were tons of other men. There were prostitutes, there were old lodgers, because like I said before, he had a lot of lodgers through the years. Most of these men had the same story. They would come to stay with him and they would be drugged and sexually assaulted. One of the old lodgers was able to identify Todd Stoops, Larry Pearson, and Robert Sheldon out of the photographs. The skull in the closet was eventually identified as Robert Sheldon through dental x-rays, and the partially decomposed head was identified as Larry Pearson through dental records. At one point, the task force released some of the tamer photos to the media to help identify the men, and this resulted in 2 men that went to school with Mark Wallace calling to identify him in one of the photos. For the acts he committed against Christopher Bryson, he was initially charged with 1 count of felonious restraint, 1 count of assault, and 7 counts of sodomy. But he took a plea bargain, and he was only charged with 1 count of forcible sodomy, but he was charged where he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was also given 1 count of the felonious restraint and received 7 years for that. For Larry Pearson, Bob was charged with first-degree murder, but he took a plea bargain where he received life in prison without parole because he wanted to avoid the death penalty. But to receive this plea, he had to go under oath and go into detail about what he did to Larry. For the other 5 victims, he also made a plea deal. He was charged with first-degree murder for Robert Shelton, and for some reason only second-degree murder for the other 4 victims. For this plea deal, again, he had to go into detail about what he did to every victim. The judge ended up giving him 5 concurrent life sentences, and he was sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary. While in prison, Bob was diagnosed with depressive personality disorder and as a sexual sadist. He also showed no remorse for his actions, and he was a very difficult inmate. Todd Stoops' mother ended up suing him for wrongful death. She did win a settlement of $5 million, but of course Bob didn't have that kind of money. But what it meant was that Bob couldn't sell his story to anyone for books or movies or whatever, so he couldn't make money off of what he did to these people. In 1992, Bob had written his old counselor several times to say that the prison guards or the prison staff were refusing his heart medication. On October 8th, he was 43 years old and he started having really bad chest pains. So the prison guards took him to the infirmary around 2 p.m. Right away, the infirmary called for an ambulance to take him to the hospital. But Bob died of a heart attack at 3:55 at the hospital. Can't say that many people were sad. I wouldn't be either. His allegations against the prison guards were never investigated. He could be totally lying, or maybe they were withholding his heart medication. We'll never know. I thought I was aware of most of the serial killers in the U.S. It's a strange fascination of mine. I like to get inside their heads to see why they do the things they do, but I didn't know about the Kansas City Butcher until pretty recently. I hope you enjoyed the video. I wanted to switch things up a little bit this week. If you have any case suggestions from the Midwest, drop a comment below. If you like my content, please hit the like button and subscribe. And until next time.